Hello again, and welcome to the seventh of our lectures on the foundations of Western civilization. In the last lecture, we introduced the Greek world, particularly the earliest stages of the Greek world, the world of the Mycenaeans, and before them, the world of the Minoans. In this lecture, we're going to turn to the period that followed the Mycenaeans. Roughly speaking, we'll be talking about the period from 1200 BC on down to something like 550 BC. We're going to go through two periods that scholars call the Greek Dark Ages and the Greek Archaic period. Now, it's very important to say, in other words, that Greek glory did not rise in a straight line from the Mycenaeans to the world of Pericles and Plato. There were a few bumps in the road along the way, and today we're going to drive over, carefully, some of those bumps. Now, between about 1200 and about 1100, there's considerable evidence in the Greek world for widespread destruction of a number of the major Mycenaean sites. One of the things that happens when buildings burn, even if later on they are rebuilt or even if earth covers them over, archaeologists can dig down and find burn levels in the stone. So this is one of the ways that we discover when there has been widespread destruction. We could, on occasion, get fooled by just a fire that was incidental or coincidental, but generally it shows us destruction. And we find a lot of evidence for this in the Greek world after about 1200. In other words, really after the Trojan Wars. Now, this implies something interesting, or permits us again an inference, you see. We talked much about inference in the last couple of lectures. It may very well be that whatever we think of the Trojan Wars as having been, remember I said it was kind of a grotty little trade war, probably, but it may have come at the end of a long period of contention. And it may very well be that the Mycenaeans spent themselves in this long period of contention. So a bit like, for example, the Egyptians and the Hittites simply wearing each other out over a period of time and then entering on a kind of a long decline. There may have been some decline in the Greek world, occasioned by these struggles that had that come to represent themselves for us so vividly in the Iliad. Well, we find then, in any case, this period of considerable evidence of destruction in these major Mycenaean sites. Now, it's interesting, too, that a number of them were never again re-inhabited. That's not true for all of them. Corinth was, Pylos was, but Mycenae, the greatest of the Mycenaean sites, was never again inhabited. You can go to it today, and it rests in a kind of a sovereign repose. It's really haunting in a certain way to go to that place and to think of Agamemnon and the other Greeks. Now, later Greek memory and the archaeological record both suggest that we can make some sense of these invasions in connection with some people called the Dorians. Now, the Greeks basically later remembered the Dorian invasions as if it were somehow one process, one great invasion with one people primarily involved, primarily sort of making all of the trouble. It's certainly true that the Dorians were one of the groups who pushed southward into the Balkans at about this time. Probably they were people who had trailed behind those much earlier migrations of people into the Balkans. They may very well have settled up in what we call Thessaly, for example, considerably further to the north, and now, after the Mycenaean period, have begun moving yet further south and entering the Peloponnesus, that is to say, the southernmost portion of the Balkan Peninsula, the great peninsula on the bottom of the peninsula, if you like, the land on the other side of the Gulf of Corinth, if you have a sort of a picture of the Greek world in your mind. Now, what is clear is that the Dorians were not alone in disrupting Greece, even if the Greek tradition later remembered the story that way and remembered the Dorians as the great invaders. Introducing the Dorians provides us with an opportunity to clear up a couple of pieces of technology. If the terminology, forgive me. If the Dorians themselves are a puzzle, so too are one or two other things. For example, why do we call the Greeks Greeks? Why do we call their land Greece? We do that because the Romans did. The Romans called them Graeci, and they called their land Graecia. And we basically borrowed our terminology from Latin, which isn't playing fair with the Greeks. They called themselves Hellenes, and they called their land Hellas. And the word that we have as Greek, they would have as Helladic. But anyway, we're probably not going to get away from Greek and Greece, so we'll stick with that. Now, it's also true to say that there are several kinds of Greeks. There isn't just one kind of Greek, there are several. Now, We talked in the last lecture briefly about how difficult it is to characterize people ethnically, biologically, over long periods of time. It's probably fair to say that there were some modest differences among the various kinds of Greeks, but the fundamental differences among them were linguistic. They spoke Greek in slightly different ways. Now, the basic groups are the Dorians, about whom we have spoken just a moment ago, and then the Ionic Greeks. Those are the Greeks who lived over on the Aegean coast of Anatolia, all right? What the Romans would later call Asia Minor, what we would think of as Western Turkey. There are the Aeolic Greeks. The Aeolic Greeks are the ones who live in the northernmost portion of the Greek world, north of the Gulf of Corinth, or northwest of Athens. And there are finally the Attic Greeks. Those are the Greeks of Athens. Now, how do these Greeks differ from one another? How would you recognize one? If we take a word like demos, the Greek word for people, spelled out in English, D-E-M-O-S. In Doric Greek, that same word is D-A-M-O-S. So instead of saying demos, you said damos. It's not so unlike, for example, the differences in the way a person from Boston and a person from Savannah might speak our American English. It's basically the same language. Slightly different vocabulary, slightly different expressions, slightly different pronunciation. But that's the kind of differences, that's the scale of differences we're dealing with. And they aren't so great. But we do have different peoples then around the Greek world in different places. Now the Dorian invasions ushered in a period that we refer to as the Greek Dark Ages. Now, we don't call this the Dark Ages because we're trying to be insulting to it, because we're trying to say that it was an awful time. It is a time of small, illiterate communities. Let me repeat that. It's a time of small, illiterate communities. Now, I'm sure you're thinking along with me, and you're thinking, gee, he explained all of that business about language and linear scripts and syllabic scripts and linear B documents, and they were actually written in Greek and all that. What do you mean illiterate? The Greeks forgot how to write. They're the only people we know of historically who achieved writing and lost it. Now, they're going to get it back pretty soon. But the point is, they forgot how to write. So now we have no linear B documents. We have no documents at all. And the later tradition actually doesn't seem to have known very much about this period, which we can say runs, well, maybe 1100 down to sort of 900, 800 BC, roughly, the Greek Dark Ages. So it's dark fundamentally because it's a period about which we know little. We can shed very little light on it. That's the sense in which it's dark. But it doesn't appear to have been an entirely felicitous time either. It was a time of depopulation. It was a time of deurbanization, and it appears to have been a time of scant construction. We just don't see the kinds of grand structures that marked the Mycenaean period. Now, this is a good opportunity to pause and say just a quick word about archaeology and the elaboration of the discipline of archaeology. Archaeologists found without trouble those spectacular Mycenaean sites. Many of them are sort of poking through the ground today, and they're visible to the naked eye, although excavators have had to take them down a great deal to really get to the root of things, to get to the bottom of things. When archaeology first arose a few centuries ago, in a clear way in the middle of the 19th century, but in a certain sense it actually rose before that, archaeology was essentially the servant of museum science and then of art history. Archaeologists went out and looked for beautiful things to put them on display. That's fundamentally what they did. The great, one might sort of put tongue in cheek and say that the great goal of early archaeology was to find the Venus de Milo's arms. You see, this would have made you famous. And you found these wonderful things, and you put them in museums, and you arrayed them room by room, and so on. Now, there's no archaeologist in the world today who wouldn't love to find a beautiful thing. But archaeology today is based on and is dedicated to something very different. Modern survey archaeology is designed basically to take large sites and slowly but surely to strip the soil away layer by layer by layer to uncover life as it was lived, to find humble things, ordinary dwellings, to find humble things like ordinary crockery, ordinary ceramics, to go digging through garbage pits to find what percentages of chicken bones and what percentages of pig bones and what percentages of beef bones you find in the garbage pits in order to make guesses about diets, in order to make guesses about what people ate, in order to make guesses about their protein intake and this kind of thing. In other words, today, archaeology is really much more interested in figuring out how people lived than in go finding the beautiful things that they left lying about. What that means is that day by day by day, the Greek Dark Ages are actually less dark to us than they were once before, even though we don't have these great spectacular palaces and beautiful things to find and to look at and to admire. Now, between about 800 and about 700 BC, the Greek world began to show the first clear signs of life and energy. Kind of a revival begins to appear all over much of the Greek world. Historians refer to this as the transitional period between the Dark Ages, less dark all the time as I've said, and the Archaic period, the great classical period, to which we'll turn in a series of lectures, beginning with the next one, follows this Archaic period. Now, the great achievements of this transitional period of the early part of the Archaic period, the great achievements of this period, the fundamental achievement is the creation of the polis, the Greek city-state, the fundamental Greek political institution, a political institution that gave vocabulary, that gave ideals to the Western world ever since. In our next couple of lectures, we're going to look at some detail at Athens and at Sparta, two of the greatest of the Greek polis. All right? For now, I just want to emphasize that we can begin to see the first faint stirrings, like a small sprout coming through the ground in early spring, of what will later be the full-flowered polis. Now, Dark Age Greece appears on the whole to have been a pretty peaceful place, a fairly easy place. Now, I said earlier in the last lecture that Greece was never an easy land to eke a living out of, and that's certainly true. But it's also true that in a world that was depopulated, in a world with much less contention than had marked the Mycenaean period, people were able to live their lives largely undisturbed by external forces. And as a result, the population began to grow. Now, one of the great problems in the Greek world is that the mountain crags, the mountain ridges, tend to work in such a way as to leave a kind of a patchwork quilt of small areas of arable land. And as a result of this, the population can pretty easily and pretty quickly outstrip the capacity of that arable land to support it. Now you've got a problem. You got more people than you can feed. What are you going to do? This began to generate a whole series of important and complex social tensions in the Greek world. And it's probably this gradual pressure of population on resources that leads to some of the steps that begin to generate the polis, as I suggested a few minutes ago. Now, by around 900, 800 BC, the commercial exploits of the Phoenicians may very well have been in the first place a spur to the Greeks. Wealth generated by trade might either supplement or upset the very delicate balance of life in essentially agricultural communities. The Greeks knew that the Phoenicians were trading. There were some Greeks who were already beginning to engage in trade. There's no place in the Greek world that's more than about 150 miles from the sea. It's much easier to get to the sea and travel around by sea than it is to travel overland in Greece. If any of you have ever driven in Greece, if any of you have ever tried to take a train in Greece, you know this to be the case. It's not an easy land to move about in. By around 750 BC, or thereabouts, various Greek cities began to display one or another of three responses to these tensions generated in this period, occasioned by rising population and limited resources. The first response, particularly associated with Sparta, you conquer your neighbors. You don't have enough soil, you don't have enough land, you conquer your neighbors. The Spartans conquered the Messenians, the people who lived to the west of them in the Peloponnesus, and reduced them to slavery, turned them into helots, state slaves. We'll talk more about them in the next lecture when we turn to Sparta. Another way to do it, we might say, is to Phoenicianize. Athens was the Greek city that decided that what they would do essentially is live by trade. Rather than making everything they needed, they would trade and generate the wealth to permit them to buy whatever they needed. So the Athenians turned in particular to commercial ventures. Now, this made them, as I said, a bit like the Phoenicians, makes them a bit like the later Venetians and Dutch. a point that I'd emphasized already in connection with the Phoenicians when we talked about them. A third possibility. Corinth is perhaps the best example of this, but there were others in the Greek world. You colonize. You export your surplus population. Now, you don't just sort of throw them out the door. That's not the point, because you do have pressures in the city. These are your fellow citizens. You want to maintain some connection with them. So you send these people to places where they will create cities of their own and maintain very close, very cordial, very effective relations with the mother city. Quite literally, that's what the Greek word metropolis means. It means a mother city. We in English tend to use the word metropolis for a big city. We think of New York as a metropolis, you see. But actually, strictly speaking, it's a mother city. You have to have sent out colonies, and then you're a metropolis. Well, these colonies were planted all around the Black Sea region. They were planted along the North African coast in the area that we would think of as Libya. They were planted in southern Italy and in Sicily. Indeed, southern Italy and Sicily became so full of Greek colonies that the area came to be called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Ever strike you that the cities in Sicily bear Greek names? Syracuse? That's not a Latin name, that's a Greek name. And Naples, Napoli. What could be more Italian than Napoli? Italian schmalion. Neapolis, new city, a Corinthian colony. So the Corinthians then planted colonies, but other Greek cities planted colonies as well. Now, this process of colonization is interesting and important to us because it reveals sort of the inventiveness, the cleverness, the adaptability, the flexibility of the Greeks in responding to a problem. They all faced more or less the same problem, and they dealt with it in quite different ways. That's one important thing. Another important thing, though, is to say that spreading these colonies all around the Mediterranean world was of enormous historical significance. If you've traveled in the Mediterranean world, you have seen beautiful Greek temples in Sicily. And you've seen beautiful Greek temples in southern Italy. And you've seen beautiful Greek temples along the North African coast. Greek art, Greek architecture, the Greek language, Greek values, Greek literature, Greek political institution, Greek ways of life were spread all over the Mediterranean basin. Now, I suggested when we talked about the Phoenicians that they represented the first such evidence of a spreading of a common culture around the Mediterranean. But the Phoenicians were never as numerous, and they were never as self-conscious as the Greeks were about spreading themselves and all that they represented. And remember, these colonies were meant to maintain close relationship with their mother city. They weren't meant to be something wholly new, something wholly different. They were meant to be little extensions of Greece wherever they went, and so they were. Now, this was crucial in continuing this process, but accelerating this process of making of the Mediterranean basin a common cultural realm. Now, it's important to say, too, the Greeks did not merely spread out and take themselves all about the place. They learned, they borrowed. We'll have occasion when we talk about Greek philosophy, perhaps when we talk about Greek history, to see some concrete ideas which the Greeks learned from others and borrowed from others. But for the moment, let me just instance one crucial thing. They borrowed an alphabet from the Phoenicians, so that when the Greeks finally started writing again, probably in the 8th century BC, they write in the familiar Greek script that we know, basically the Greek script that has been used since about the 8th century BC, right down to now. Not like the script of those Linear B documents. And then, of course, as I mentioned, they stopped writing altogether for a period of some, perhaps 200 or 300 years, something like that. So the Greeks were never unwilling to borrow. We mustn't suppose that Greek influence is always a one-way street. The Greeks are giving things to people. They also knew how to take things from others. Now, the latter stages of the Dark Ages and the first phase of the Archaic period, okay, excuse me, this transitional period, perhaps the 8th century BC, more or less, also begins to show us evidence for some of the most familiar aspects of Greek ways of thinking, of Greek attitudes, of Greek values, of issues that will be with us for the next several lectures. So let's suggest a little about what some of these emerging ideas were say a few things about them and see if we can't see how we may take them with us in some of our following lectures. Decorations on pottery. Now, you may think this a humble place to start, but designs on ceramics. Now, the Greeks were able to make beautiful pots, but the Greeks were not the first people historically to make beautiful pots. But they were among the first people to put beautiful geometric designs on their pots. Geometry, the science of measuring the earth. But what does this suggest to you? You know, if I asked you to close your eyes, now if you're listening to this in a car, you probably don't want to do that. But if you were to close your eyes and think geometry, you think shapes, you think forms, you think, don't you, of a certain sense of order, of balance, of harmony, of measure, of proportion. And don't all of those things sound awfully Greek? There's a tendency on some of these pots to reduce the shape of living things to geometric forms. A very common motif, for example, often around the neck of a Greek pot, is to have a series of deer all following one another, or stags, actually. And in each instance, the bodies of each deer are described in almost exactly the same way. It's a highly stylized kind of image. It's a very abstract kind of image. It is an image that abstracts something from the world around us, something from the familiar world that we see. It is to turn the familiar into what is even more familiar but less visible, that is to say, geometry. It is to suggest, in another way, that behind all that we see, there may be another realm, another kind of truth, another kind of beauty, another kind of perfection, of which all things in this world are but imperfect examples, or suggestions, or hints, or possibilities. Now, we saw that, did we not, in connection with Zoroastrianism. I'm not trying to turn the Greeks into Zoroastrians. I'm not trying to turn the Zoroastrians into Greeks. I'm saying again, it is a common phenomenon, a common way of thinking about certain issues. But the next time you're in a museum and you see a Greek pot with these geometric designs or these highly stylized animal designs, think, stop and think, what do they suggest to you? What do they invite you to think about? And I think you'll see this sense that not everything is quite as we see it, and that there is a quest for order, balance, harmony, and proportion. Now, it's also very important to say that at a very early stage, the Greeks achieve a spectacular level of technical virtuosity in their sculpture, in their ceramics, in vase painting eventually when they put pictures on ceramic and so on. So this is important too, and we'll come back to that point. Because with the Greeks, there is always techne. Techne is Greek for skill. There's always skill, accomplishment. But then there is the vision that informs the use of that skill. The Greeks are not alone in this. What is alone, what the Greeks are unique in, is the ways in which they put these two things together. Early Greek sculpture across this archaic period begins sometimes in stone, sometimes in bronze. The bronze figures obviously are cast, not carved. But early Greek sculpture begins to give us some interesting and important hints. Some interesting and important hints about little differences between the way the Greeks think of the world and the way some of their neighbors did. If you looked, for example, at Egyptian sculpture, if you looked at a good deal of Mesopotamian sculpture, if you looked at Hittite sculpture, one of the things you would see is figures that are rigid and frontal and unblinking, unfeeling, unchanging. What they communicate is all that does not change. There is again a sense of abstraction there, that's true. But with the Greeks we begin. In a later lecture we'll bring this more fully into view. But we begin to get a hint, a suggestion, that an image represents an actual person who walked upon the earth, who is distinctive, who is different from everybody else, who looks like that, and not like a rigid, lifeless, eternal kind of figure. So the Greeks have the capacity to be technically proficient, they have the capacity to look for abstraction behind the world we live in, and they have the capacity to observe very, very closely the world we live in. This blend, we will see later, is enormously positive and creative and generative. Now, let's go back to Homer's poems. We left off poor Homer as we were trying to extract from his poems certain things that we might be able to learn about the Mycenaean world. Now let's put Homer back in his own time and place, 800 to 700 BC in that period, and say, what do we see in these poems that may begin providing us hints about this polis that is just beginning to emerge like late winter's first crocuses? Well, what we open up, I think, now, and I suggested this at the end of the last lecture, is a vista on ideologies, on values, but also, I think, some hints of that world's changes. Remember, we've talked about this period, 800 to 700, as transitional between the Dark Ages and the Archaic period. I think in the very Homeric poems, we can feel some of these changes. For instance, one of the things we find in the Iliad, you find these things in the Odyssey too, but I'm essentially focusing on the Iliad. One of the things that we find is intense competition. These Greeks are very competitive people. Now, we may think they, after all, invented the Olympic Games, and the Olympic Games happened every 4 years, but in the other 3 years, there were other games, the Isthmian, the Nemean, and the Panhellenic Games. So there were games going on in the Greek world all the time. Athletic means about prizes. You didn't play for the fun of it. The game was not the thing. Winning the game was the thing. These Greeks were competitive. Now, think of the soldiers in the Iliad. We have a picture of two great armies arrayed on a battlefield, but they're basically nameless and faceless to us, aren't they? What we have is two warriors. Our vision is always on two warriors. They come out on the battlefield and they make speeches to each other. They fight verbally before they ever strike a blow in earnest. And then they fight and they speechify and they fight and they speechify and they fight and they speechify. So there's physical competition and there's verbal competition. What would the Greeks have loved more than verbal competition? Somebody will be struck a mortal blow. He doesn't just die and kind of get himself off. He dies for 100 lines, making speeches, telling us. He's fighting with us sometimes, the audience. Here's what you're supposed to think about this. Remember this, do that. This powerful sense of competition. Very Greek, that. Reflections on brains and brawn. Kind of poor, big, dumb lummox Achilles. He never quite gets it. And various other figures in the story are like that. Wise old Nestor, the wise old man. He's the one, when the going gets tough, they always turn to. What do we do now? The question of whether the kings are as smart as they ought to be, as wise as they ought to be. A great play. What is important in this great battle playing out before the walls of Iliad? Brains or brawn? Respective obligations of the individual and the community. The Iliad begins, sing, muse, Aida, hence the name of a great opera. Sing, muse, the wrath of Achilles, Peleus' son. The whole story is about whether Achilles' wrath was justified or not. He has been affronted, so he thinks. He takes himself off from the battle. The Greeks suffer and suffer and suffer, and they go to him, won't you fight, won't you fight, won't you fight? No. And we are not presented with a story as if Achilles is simply a bad guy. He has a case. He has been affronted. His honor has been damaged. How can his honor be repaired and remedied so that he might rejoin the battle? Only when his great friend Patroclus is killed does he go back, and then not because he owes anything to the Greeks, but because he owes something to the memory of his dead friend. So we're beginning to see the struggles of a political community. What do I owe you? What do you owe me? What demands can I make on you? What demands can you make on me? What's the nature of authority? Who participates? The great, the powerful, the important, or ordinary people? There's the one powerful scene in the Iliad when Tersites, an ordinary soldier, dares to speak in the presence of his betters and gets flogged for it. But in fact, in the new polis, it's going to be a world where citizens do the talking, and where they come increasingly to see that they have no betters, they have equals. and they will speak to them as equals. We also see in this period powerful changes in warfare. As these towns must attack their neighbors or defend their neighbors, they must mobilize the ordinary citizens. They must mobilize the hoplite, who now fights in a phalanx, serried rows, one after another, of hoplite soldiers. You cannot ask people to fight and bleed and die for their city and deny them participation. So the Greek world, Homer's world, provides us a vista on Greek politics, on Greek religion, and we'll turn to Greek religion in somewhat more detail in a couple of later lectures, and it opens up the dawning classical world, the world of the polis. And it is to the two greatest of the Greek polis, Sparta and Athens, that we will turn in the next two lectures.